school absence is on the rise, and parents could now pay the price literally in the form of fines. As many as 170,000 pupils are skipping school on a regular basis, and non-attendance has doubled in the last 4 years. Michael Gove thinks he has the solution. He says parents should lose their child benefit payments if their children play truant. The Levelling Up Secretary is set to include the idea in an action plan for antisocial behaviour he's preparing for Rishi Sunak. Among the supporters of the idea is Ryan Shorthouse from Bright Blue, a centre-right think tank. He joins me now, as does Anne Longfield, chair of the Commission on Young Lives and member of the Times Education Commission. She says families need help, not punishment. Ryan, welcome back to the programme. I see you're still in situ. So has the Tory party improved and you're still prepared to speak for them?
Well, remember, I'm part of an independent think tank.
Indeed, but the last time we spoke, it was about the fact you were leaving because you couldn't condone certain Conservative policies. But here you are.
Yeah, no. Well, I'm still the director, and I'm still in post until the late summer, autumn, when my successor will take over. But I'm still going to chair the think tank, so I'm taking on a slightly different role. So.
Okay, so talk me through then. No, well, we're glad we haven't seen the back of you. Talk me through this good idea that you have, or that Michael Gove has had. Parents can already get fined for non-attendance, which is enforced by councils, and the rules obviously vary. So what would actually change?
Well, I think it's not the only thing that will help, but I do think it's a reasonable idea. In some countries in Latin America and in Europe, they have conditional cash transfers. So benefits that you receive from the state are conditional upon you doing certain behaviours. And there's some good evidence that when it's tied to school enrolment, that has improved school attendance rates. So the evidence, I think, is pretty robust that it gets children, particularly from more disadvantaged backgrounds, back into school. And fundamentally, that's the best place to ensure that they get a good education. I mean, at the end of the day, it is parents who have the ultimate responsibility for making sure that their child attends school. And, the consequences for the child, for the family, for wider society of a child not receiving a good education are very stark. And I think it's right that we underline the importance to parents of making sure that their children are attending school.
Indeed, but these choices are often, from parents' points of view, socio-economic as well. I mean, we were talking earlier about the exorbitant cost of childcare, which is not yet being addressed by the government. But also, which doesn't get brought up very often, is the sort of Victorian nature of school hours. So if you want to be, at work full time, for a lot of parents, it's very, very difficult to do that and combine it with being responsible for your child and not having, a kid sitting at home for 3 hours on their own or doing, worse out on the streets. So, I mean, it's not just about parents willfully sort of ignoring their children's needs and indulging their desire not to go to school, is it?
Well, I mean, I'm a parent of 2 children under the age of 3, so I know how difficult it can be. I haven't had a good night's sleep in a long time. So it is tough for parents. But I'm afraid, being on a low income is not an excuse for ensuring that your child is going to school. School in this country is free at the point of use. It's free. Obviously, we pay for it through taxes, but there is no financial barrier to ensuring that your child attends school. So yes, of course it's difficult, but I'm afraid, I think it is the parents' responsibility to ensure the child attending school. Look, I know
let me bring Anne Longfield in. And Anne, what was your instinct when you heard this proposal?
Well, of course, my heart sank. We know that Michael Gove is renowned for bold suggestions, and this is one of those, but I'm afraid I think it is a misguided one. There has been a huge spike in the number of kids who aren't attending school. But a large proportion of those are desperately seeking help. Their parents are desperately seeking help to enable those children to go back to school. We've seen a huge rise.
And what are the reasons that they're not attending school then?
Well, the numbers of children who are suffering really chronic anxiety, which wasn't the case before COVID, COVID is now very high. We've seen a 3 times increase in children who are absent from school because of illness since before the pandemic. And I speak to parents whose children were, happily bubbling along, sometimes quite middle-class families. They were doing well, expected to do well in their grades, and they haven't been able to return after the pandemic because they now have chronic anxiety. They're on a waiting list for SEND support. They're on a waiting list to be diagnosed in terms of potentially autism, other conditions. And they're in this dreadful limbo land. So the parents know more than anyone how desperately in need those children are of getting back into school, but they need that support to get there.
Isn't it also true, though, Anne, that there are parents who, for one reason or another, choose not to go to the trouble of pushing their kids to go to school? So, of course, there is, as we know, a mental health, epidemic, particularly among, teenagers as a result of the pandemic. But there are other contributing factors as well. We can't make this all about vulnerable children.
No, I suppose my point there was that children that we might not have thought were vulnerable before the pandemic and that were, on a trajectory to get really good grades. Situation. So often you have a parent who has to give up work, suddenly a waiting list takes over their life. But yes, there will be families as well, and often poor families who have really suffered a much increased levels of poverty during the pandemic, and also have had many more impacts, and they will be in a much more difficult situation. But, I think for any parent who has a child who is, very upset in the morning, who says that, they can't get out of bed, the parent has to get to work. There is a point where they have to make a decision. But that's why it's so important to get those, those support services in place, the attendance workers in place, to be able to work out strategies to get those kids confident enough to be able to go back into school.
And just briefly, Anne, what role does income and deprivation play in this? Quite a large one, as I understand it.
Yes, that's right. So 35% of children, poor children, weren't attending regularly during the autumn of 21 and the spring of 22, compared to 18% of other children. So there is, a huge impact here. But was this the case before COVID? No, the levels were much lower, which is why we need that recovery program to support these families to be able to do what they want to do and get the kids back into school.
So, Ryan, how would it help withdrawing child benefit from these families who are clearly already struggling?
Look, I think it has to be applied sensitively.
What does that mean in reality? Is there going to be a sensitivity monitor for the people whose child benefit is withdrawn or not?
Well, of course, when the school reports the persistent truancy, then obviously if a child is suffering from severe mental health problems, that obviously needs to be taken into account, but whether the child benefit is removed or not.
But who's going to decide that? Because obviously there is a mental health crisis. There aren't experts to be seen. People are not getting appointments for 6 months, even a year. So I'm not sure who's going to be deciding whether the child's mental health issues are important enough. It just seems to me quite a policy fraught with pitfalls, a bit like perhaps the small boats policy currently being discussed. But we won't delve into that today.
No, of course, and no policy is ever perfect. And like I say, I think there should be, if a child is persistently truanting and the school and the parent both claim that that's because of profound severe mental health problems and that's an issue, then I think that should be available.
But also we've just established that it is also socio-economically impacted, and you're talking about making the socio-economic impact even greater.
Well, I don't think being on low income is a justification for not sending your child to school. I think most people who are in poverty and are on low income would find it insulting that somehow their material circumstances affect whether they send their child to school or not.
Let me turn to you, Anne, just very quickly. What would you do instead?
Well, look, I welcome this focus on children who aren't in school. It is really important. And Michael Gove wants a rigorous focus. And I agree, I'm all up for that. But what I think we need is to get away from the idea this is willful truancy, to actually examine the reasons children aren't in school in depth, and to be able to have the support those families need on a consistent level to get those children back into school, whatever it takes. It's something which is going to potentially diminish the life chances, as Ryan said, of these kids throughout their lives. So it is urgent, and it's one that needs action now. Well,
thank you both very much indeed for joining me today. That was Anne Longfield, Chair of the Commission on Young Lives, and Ryan Shorthouse from Bright Blue, a centre-right think tank.